Hi, I'm Michael Corris, professor and chair of the Division of Art at SMU, and with me today is Charlie Gere, professor at the Lancaster Institute for Contemporary Arts at Lancaster University in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
Charlie's been giving some lectures here, some seminars, and we're going to talk a little bit about his work in media theory and history. So the first thing I'd like to ask you is, tell me a little bit about the idea behind this new collection of essays of yours, Community Without Community.
Okay, well, it started, as you might remember, Michael, when you and I did something together in Sheffield. You asked me to come and give a talk, and I gave a talk called Non-Relational Aesthetics, which was a bit of a critique of Nicolas Bourriaud, the famous or infamous curator and theorist of relational aesthetics. And out of that has developed a whole notion about thinking beyond these, I suppose, slightly tired tropes of community and relationality and collaboration to something more excessive, I guess, or something to do with what happens beyond these kinds of collaborations. So community without community is a phrase I picked up from Jean-Luc Nancy, meaning the community of those who have no community, in effect,
Yes.
aren't bound together by ethics or ethnics or whatever. Right. So it's a trope thinking about art to a certain extent.
Right. There is a lot of discussion now, the dialogue between, say, Grant Kester and Claire Bishop, the work of Shannon Jackson, that's sort of focusing on this idea of community and artists involved in social engagement, the whole question of the context of art. In terms of artists working today then, what is their position in a context, in a world where we're surrounded by media, by these kinds of connective media that presume to develop these intimate relations?
Yes, I think one of the problems is that what seems to me to have happened in a sense with the media, more generally, and this relates to this, is where artists once were in some ways a kind of avant-garde of developments. What McLuhan calls the artist as the early warning system that tells culture what's just about to happen to it. It seems in some ways they're following behind a kind of technological avant-garde that's doing in advance of art what artists then sort of try to recuperate to some extent.
Right.
I don't think that's entirely fair, but the sort of powerful networks and kind of connections with social media in some ways outstrip what relational aesthetics might pretend to do.
If we drill down a little bit deeper to that problem, why is it that artists are no longer able to confront the world in that way, in the way that McLuhan described?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. It's something to do with shifting temporalities and the sort of speed at which culture takes place, if you like. It's quite hard to put this very clearly, but technology in a sense moves faster than almost our human capacity to kind of engage with it. I think at the point at which this tipped was probably around about the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, when technological development began to accelerate with the rise of various forms of recorded media, the internal combustion engine, flight and so forth, and artists were beginning to play the game of catch-up in a world which was outstripping their capacity to prefigure it, to be the kind of notion of the avant-garde, those people who go in front. So I think there's a massive problem now in a sort of almost inhuman temporality, which either you are playing a game of catch-up as an artist, trying to sort of get up and get to speed with, or maybe you need to play another kind of game with a little strategy about an intervention within that temporality.
Right. Because I'm thinking that perhaps some of the models that artists inherit and pick up during their education might be woefully out of date. And I'm not referring specifically to working with a particular media, but the whole idea of where the subject of the artist is to be found and what the artist should be doing.
Yes, and there's a sort of, again, there's a more complex answer to that, I think. Yes, on the one hand, it might be out of date. On the other hand, is that necessarily a bad thing? And is being out of date always disadvantageous?
Yes.
Is trying to be up to the moment possibly itself a problem? And being sort of out of joint with time, if you like, may actually be quite a profoundly useful strategy for artists to kind of exploit. There are, I guess, tropes or models of the subjectivity of the artist which may be problematic. You know, the kind of sovereign artist, the demiurge who creates ex nihilo. And I think that is possibly not useful as a model, and yet it still remains very powerful within the art world. You know, people like Damien Hirst, who get sort of figured as these iconic characters, right? So I think there are a number of different issues going on, and it's not simply a question of artists remoulding what an artist is according to models presented by a new media context. Mm-hmm. It's more about how they act with relation to that in such a way that there is a space for something called art. It isn't merely technology or design or something.
Right, and I suppose because society now places such great expectations on art.
Yeah.
It's asked to do so many things.
Yeah.
That it might be difficult to figure out what exactly any individual artist might do or contribute in this way.
Well, yes, one of the problems is that much of the kind of, I suppose, the narrative thrust of art that's maybe starts in the late 19th century and goes on through to, let's say, about the 1960s, 70s, that of the endless pushing of boundaries, that kind of, that myth, if you like, has exhausted itself without finding any adequate replacement. Right? People I know, for example, in the north of England, there's Grisdale Arts, are seeking for a different model of what art might be, looking back to Ruskin, but also looking at the contemporary context of the rural culture in which they live in. Art as ethics, art as a kind of, it's a bit like a relational aesthetics, but without some of its more problematic aspects, in my view. So they are searching for an alternative. I don't know to what extent they absolutely succeed, but the sense that the kind of the trajectory that maybe starts, let us say, with Van Gogh, maybe finds its apogee with Duchamp and Cage, and then winds itself down possibly by the mid-70s, and we are simply eking out the kind of last moments of that is possibly a problem.
Yes, prolonging the pain, I think,
Yes.
as Michael Fried said, when somebody asked him, what about shaped canvases,
Right.
shaped supports for
Yes.
painting?
And on it goes.
Yes.
And one wriggle, one kind of attempt to rethink the boundaries within a very particularly already delimited context. And that seems to be, on the one hand, artists, yes, they're asked to do a lot. And, art does remain, to a large extent, a secular culture's sort of substitute for religion, I think. We knew this back in the 19th century, we know it now. And it's asked to bear a lot of burden. On the other hand, what artists can actually do is delimited in a very, very definite way. So I think young artists, young art students, young MFA students such as here at SMU, are confronted with a big problem.
Yes, so you've visited some of our
Yeah.
graduate studios here, and you've even visited with some undergraduates.
Yeah.
Do you have some observations you'd like to share with us about this?
Well, I was really impressed. I'm not saying that just because, a grad student is here in the room filming, but also because, I was genuinely impressed by the range of work, by the originality and inventiveness of the work, and the engagement with media and materiality to a great extent, and the variety. What I found actually quite interesting and good was the degree to which they were still not able entirely clearly to articulate what they were doing. And I thought that actually was a very good thing. There was a sense of a genuine experimentality and a sort of sense, I don't quite, here I am confronted by this stuff and I sort of think it's interesting. It could be a certain materiality, a certain materials that attracted the artist, or a certain visual regime of the representation of women or something, and how they were pushing at something they couldn't quite articulate. And that little gap between what you can say and what you can't say may yet remain, for me, what distinguishes what artists do from, let's say, what designers do. Because one of the MFA students here, we talked quite a bit about why his work wasn't interior decoration, why it wasn't design. What might be the tiny gap between
Yes.
what he did and what he might be mistaken for.
And that little gap has to be valued.
Yes.
And artists have to learn how to articulate that value and teach other people how to
how to open the space.
converse with it.
Yeah.
Yes.
And to find that space that opens out to things that aren't yet sort of prefigured in a sense.
Yes.
The outcome is not yet already ordained, and I think that's maybe at a very sort of is a small but very important thing, that opening out of what materials, culture might offer us that isn't yet already understood.
Yes.
A little sort of mystery, I guess, without being too mystical about it.
There's quite a lot of intangibility here.
Yeah.
And I'm struck by the fact that you have such an incredibly sophisticated and nuanced view of materiality and making, and at the same time you're dealing with an area of artistic practice that some people would just put under the heading of dematerialization and ineffable,
Which it isn't.
ineffability.
Yeah.
Right. And so there you are with those two poles. How is this relating now to where you think you want to push your research, the progress of the research?
Progress of the research. Well, at the moment, the research is fairly straightforward. I'm supposed to be finishing a book for you. It's going to be a bit late. Let's not worry about that.
Oh, we've just started on that one.
Yeah.
Charlie, tell us a little bit about your latest book, Community Without Community. It's such a provocative title.
Well, Michael, as you know, it goes back to a talk I gave at your invitation at Sheffield Hallam on non-relational aesthetics, a term I devised as a kind of critique of Nicolas Bourriaud and some of the, it struck me, sort of like problematic claims for the kind of ethical thrust of art in terms of relationality and community. I wanted to get at a different idea about something more singular, something exceeding known community. The community comes from the work of Jean-Luc Nancy, meaning a community without identification, without some essence or substance, of people who are connected only by the fact they're in some kind of community.
Right, so more like an aggregate rather than a social network.
Not like a social, nothing that's defined by race, gender, sexual identity, but defined by almost being a non-community of singular that exceed any kind of capacity to be understood as a community. It's quite a hot topic in has been for some years in continental philosophy with people like Blanchot, Nancy and Derrida, and it seemed to me to offer a really powerful way of thinking about what artists do and how they shouldn't be bound up with the expectations, the prior expectations of communities, identities, and so on and so forth, that rather what they do must always exceed those kinds of things and not be caught up in an already known sense of duty, perhaps.
Yes, in Shannon Jackson's book, Social Work, she quotes repeatedly this admonition that sometimes artists working in that field are trying to be individuals solving structural problems, which is rather giving an individual solution to a problem that cannot be solved by an individual in that way.
Wouldn't be, and in many cases, artists are not the appropriate people to be solving those kinds of problems. In a sense, I mean, to be a little bit blunt, it's a kind of aestheticization of politics. I mean, to use a term Benjamin uses for fascism, that's a bit extreme, but the idea that art can come into complex social situations and somehow make a difference, I find quite problematic. I think it expects far too much of art, apart from anything else. And I don't think that is where the strength of what artists do is best realised. It's realised in some ways a much more singular approach to the world that does not look to validation via an already known set of goals or ethical demands. But you know, I'm going to talk about it this evening. So
yes,
the notion of a kind of secrecy about what an artist does to some extent. And I was a bit depressed, is the wrong word, but kind of aggravated by some of the rhetoric around relational aesthetics and some of the slightly more hyperbolic claims made on its behalf. So.
Yes, as the conversation goes on, people are learning they have to be much more precise about their language, much more rigorous about their thinking on this.
Yes, of course, people have done some good work in kind of, working their way around this. So, debate has gone on, as we know. But so that's, and then the book grew out of that and various other sort of attempts to approach the problem or this set of ideas from different angles. So I'm circling around something and darting in to try to engage this in a slightly circuitous way, as one has to.
So finally, I guess, what do you think the challenges are for the contemporary art school and art program in light of this?
Well, At one simple level, it is how to recruit, obviously, and I'm not being facetious. In a sense, it is making sure that students still have a sort of a good sense of coming here in both in the United States and Britain now, paying fees and so forth, with loans, and that fine art will still be a really good thing to do. And part of that, of course, will be bound up with the important, if sort of fairly straightforward issue of employability. But beyond that, making an argument for what the arts contribute in many senses to culture that can't be regarded as being purely marginal. And that's an argument we have to make as practitioners, as teachers, teaching in art schools. How we say to students, coming here is not just 3 years of, and plus whatever you might do afterwards in MFAs, of sort of having fun, and then you can go out and sort of work in Burger King. It's actually 3 years where you become a really person with a considerable sophisticated set of skills and understandings that you may well apply as an artist or elsewhere, without at the same time being too instrumental about it, without reducing it to merely training. So it's about thinking, I think.
Thinking. So the broad question, what do artists know?
What do artists know?
Completely on the agenda, always uppermost.
Always uppermost. Well, let me see if I can articulate this without making it sound wrong. There's a very good phrase in French. You know this, bête comme un peintre.
That's right. Stupid
like painter, right?
Yes.
Bêtise, it's French, and there's a beautiful passage in one of Derrida's seminars where he talks exactly about the word bête and bêtise. And I think there is something very useful about that phrase, a certain sort of stupidity, a certain refusal to know is what art actually offers, in a good way.
Yes, that reminds me of a phrase that my former colleagues in art and language have rolled out. They call it the emergency conditional.
Yes.
If an artist is asked to be something, they should be something else. And that this certainly structures their trajectory through their career.
And refusing the sort of, the kind of subsumption by dominant forces, the kind of pigeonholing, the instrumentalization, as a thing that's actually culturally important, is sort of levering open what might seem the closed systems and ideas that dominate us and finding other ways of sort of articulating them.
Yes, I like that position because I think creativity should be up for grabs.
Yes.
Should not be allowed to be hijacked by any group, any interest.
Yeah.
And perhaps, as you say, the art school is the place where this can happen and should happen.
And the further away we get from defining arts in terms of medium specificity, the further the skills become sort of an aspect of it, but not the dominant. We're not here to, painting and drawing isn't the sort of foundation. It is one of the ways. The more you understand that art, in a sense, is an empty set that can include an enormous number of different things, but the issue is not what it includes, but how it addresses them. I think it's going to be art, this strange word, art with capital A, as I call it. It's going to be, it's things it can offer that really in an increasingly instrumentalized world and an instrumentalized university, where things are increasingly intended for sort of use value. It's the one place, more and more, that this kind of openness can actually exist. And it's completely necessary for culture. This is not just like a sort of extra thing, an indulgence that you might have if you have the money. It's completely crucial that we have the space.
Well, I want to thank you for sharing your ideas with us this morning, and thank you for the talks that you've delivered and the seminars.
My pleasure. Yeah.
And good luck with the rest of your work.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Okay.